The final brush of polish on the crystal glass in Elara Vance's hand was a useless gesture. The Ethel Guard, perched 70 floors above the glittering asphalt arteries of Manhattan, was a place where perfection was not an ambition, but the baseline. Every surface already gleamed with a sterile, intimidating light, reflecting the city's skyline and the quiet desperation of the staff who polished it. At 21, Elara had perfected the art of invisibility, a necessary skill when serving people whose watches cost more than her grandmother's entire life savings. She moved between tables draped in heavy white linen, a ghost in a crisp black uniform. Her life was a study in contrasts, the cloying scent of truffle oil and vintage Bordeaux at work, the sharp, earthy smell of herbs and boiled cabbage in the tiny queen's apartment she shared with her grandmother, Anya. She'd come to New York 5 years ago, a refugee from a forgotten conflict in the Balkans, carrying nothing but a small wooden box of her grandmother's and a history she rarely spoke of. Anya, with her gnarled knuckles and eyes that held the memory of mountains and massacres, was the only family Elara had left. "Table 7, Elara. On your toes," muttered Carlos, the maitre d', his voice a low hiss. "It's Julian Croft, the Julian Croft." Elara's breath hitched. Even in a restaurant that catered exclusively to the 1%, the Croft name was a thunderclap. Julian Croft was a titan of technology, a man who had reshaped the digital landscape with algorithms and ruthless acquisitions. His net worth was a subject of speculative articles in financial journals, a figure with so many zeros it seemed abstract, unreal. She smoothed her apron, her fingers brushing against the faint, lace-like pattern that circled her own wrist, a faded remnant of a reddish-brown stain, mostly hidden by her uniform's long sleeve. A nervous habit. She approached the table, her tray held high and steady. Julian Croft was exactly as imposing as his reputation suggested. He sat with the rigid posture of a man who commanded boardrooms and bent markets to his will. His suit was a whisper of dark, expensive wool, his silver hair impeccably styled. But his eyes, a startlingly pale blue, were hollowed out by a grief so profound it seemed to suck the light from the room. Opposite him sat a young woman. Lily, his daughter, her face a mask of misery. She was beautiful, with her father's piercing eyes and a cascade of dark hair, but her designer dress seemed to hang on a frame made of pure anxiety, and beside Lily, holding court, was a woman who radiated a glacial authority. Her name was Beatrice Sterling, and her son was Lily's fiancé. Beatrice's diamonds glittered like chips of ice, and her smile was a thin, bloodless line. "Utterly unacceptable," Beatrice was saying, her voice cutting through the restaurant's hushed ambiance like shattering glass. "To cancel the day before? It's common. It's tacky. I told you we should have simply scheduled a French manicure at the plaza. Classic. Elegant." "Mother wanted it," Lily whispered, her voice trembling. She had the artist booked years ago. It was supposed to be a connection to her. Julian Croft's jaw tightened at the mention of his late wife, Isolde. The story was society legend. The tech billionaire who had fallen for a woman of mysterious, rustic European origins, a woman who wore hand-spun linen to galas and was said to read fortunes in the patterns of leaves. She had died of a sudden illness 2 years ago, leaving a gaping hole in the fabric of his life. "I'll find someone else," Julian said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He was already tapping on his phone. "I'll pay whatever it takes. Someone in this city can paint flowers on your hands, Lily." "It's not just flowers, Dad," Lily choked out, tears welling. "It was the Zemlya ink, the sigils of passage. The artist was one of the last ones who knew the old ways, the Vatra ways." The word hit Elara like a physical blow. Vatra. The Vatra people. Her people. A small nomadic tribe from the Dinaric Alps, scattered to the winds by war, their culture fading like an old photograph. The Zemlya ink, made from sacred mountain clay and crushed herbs. The sigils of passage, patterns drawn on a bride's hands and feet, not for beauty, but for strength, for wisdom, for protection. Her grandmother's voice filled her head, a warm, accented murmur from 1,000 childhood evenings spent sitting on their worn apartment rug. These are not just pretty lines, Elara Moy. This is our story. Each swirl is a prayer, each diamond a shield. This is the ink of the earth, the Zemlya, and it remembers everything. Ilara's hand, the one holding the silver water pitcher, trembled. She could feel the stares of the other staff, the weight of Carlos's warning. Be invisible. Be silent. But as she looked at Lily's tear-streaked face, at the cold triumph in Beatrice Sterling's eyes, something inside her snapped. A cord of loyalty to a memory, to a dying culture, to a grieving girl she didn't even know. She took a half-step forward. "Excuse me," she heard herself say, the words a foreign sound in the rarefied air. 3 sets of eyes swiveled to her. Julian Croft's gaze was one of mild annoyance, as if a piece of furniture had spoken. Beatrice's was pure, unadulterated contempt. Only Lily looked at her with a flicker of curiosity. "I apologize for the intrusion," Elara said, her voice steadier than she felt. "But I couldn't help but overhear. The Vatra traditions, I know them." Julian Croft raised a single, dismissive eyebrow. "You're a waitress." It wasn't a question, it was a verdict. "A waitress who knows more about your late wife's heritage than anyone at this table." Beatrice Sterling sneered, her lips curling. "How quaint. Julian, call security." "No, wait," Lily pleaded, leaning forward. "What do you know?" Elara's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She was risking everything, her job, her tenuous stability, the fragile peace of her life. But the image of her grandmother, her hands gnarled with arthritis, carefully grinding herbs with a mortar and pestle, flashed in her mind. She focused on Julian Croft, the only one who truly mattered. "Sir, the Zemlya ink is not just henna. It must be mixed with 7 specific elements. Mountain clay for foundation, spring water for purity, crushed oak gall for permanence, lavender oil for peace." She paused, taking a breath before delivering the final, crucial detail. "And for a bride of a significant bloodline, a pinch of crushed amber for the sun's warmth and eternal life." The effect was instantaneous and profound. Julian Croft's face, a mask of controlled indifference, shattered. His pale blue eyes widened, the color flooding back into them as if she had just slapped him. He stared at her, truly seeing her for the first time. The memory was clear, visceral. His wife, Isolde, sitting in the garden of their summer home, her hands smelling of lavender and something else, something warm and resinous. Amber. She had told him it was a secret of her people. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice a raw whisper. "My name is Elara Vance. My grandmother is Anya Petrova. She was a keeper of sigils in the old country, from the Northern Valley clan." Beatrice scoffed. "A keeper of what? This is absurd. She's probably just read a blog." "Julian, do not be taken in by this opportunist." But Julian wasn't listening to Beatrice. He was locked in a silent communion with Elara, a bridge of shared esoteric knowledge, suddenly spanning the vast chasm between Billionaire and Waitress. "My wife," he said slowly, each word seeming to cost him a great effort, "was Isolde Jovanovic, from the Southern River clan." Elara nodded, a lump forming in her throat. The Northern Valley and Southern River clans, two branches of the same small, fractured tribe, separated by a mountain and decades of history, now meeting at a table in a Manhattan skyscraper. Lily's face was alight with a desperate, fragile hope. "Please," she said, her voice soft but urgent. "Can you do it? Can you draw the sigils?" "The full sunstone bridal pattern?" Ilara asked, the name of the most sacred and complex design falling from her lips, a test of her own. Julian Croft flinched as if she had struck him. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. He looked down at Ilara, his expression a maelstrom of suspicion, grief, and a dawning, reluctant belief. "You will come with us," he commanded, his voice regaining its authority, but laced now with an undercurrent of something else. "Or, now, Carlos," he barked, turning to the petrified maître d'hôtel. "Her shift is over. She's with me." He tossed a black credit card onto the table. "And cancel our dinner. We're leaving." Beatrice Sterling rose, her face a thunderous mask of fury. "Julian, you cannot be serious. You are taking this girl into your home to perform some sort of peasant ritual on my future daughter-in-law. The wedding is at St. Patrick's Cathedral, not in a field somewhere. I forbid it." Julian Croft turned to face her, and for the first time, Ilara saw the ruthless titan the world knew. His pale eyes were chips of ice. "Beatrice," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "this is not your decision to make. It is my daughter's, and it is my wife's legacy. You will not speak of it again." He turned and strode towards the exit, Lily scrambling to follow. He paused at the door, looking back at Ilara, who stood frozen by the table. "Well?" he demanded. "Are you coming?" Ilara looked at the half-cleared table, at the shocked faces of her colleagues, at the life she had known just 5 minutes ago, now lying in shattered pieces on the floor. Then she looked at Lily's pleading eyes. She untied her apron, laid it carefully on the back of a chair, and walked away from the only security she had, toward a future she could not possibly imagine. The ride downtown in Julian Croft's limousine was a silent, tension-filled journey through a city of ghosts. Ilara stared out the tinted window at the blur of lights, her reflection a pale, wide-eyed spectre, superimposed over the opulence of Fifth Avenue. Beside her, Lily fidgeted with the clasp of her purse, while Julian sat opposite them, staring at his hands as if they were foreign objects. The silence was broken only by the whisper of the tires on the pavement. Ilara's first stop was not the Croft penthouse, but her own walk-up in Queens. The black car, long and sleek as a panther, looked utterly alien parked on her block of crumbling brick facades and overflowing trash cans. "Wait here," she told the driver, ignoring his bewildered expression. She took the stairs 2 at a time, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm that echoed in the narrow, dimly lit hallway that always smelled of garlic and damp concrete. She burst into the apartment, calling out, "Barker! Grandma!" Anya was in her small armchair by the window, a worn woolen blanket over her knees, her hands, twisted by arthritis, resting in her lap. The television was playing a game show at a low volume, but Anya's eyes were distant, looking out at the distant glow of the Manhattan skyline. "Ilara Moy, you are home so early," she said, her voice a comforting rasp. "Is everything—" She trailed off as she saw her granddaughter's flushed cheeks and shining eyes. The story tumbled out of Ilara in a rush. The restaurant, Julian Croft, his daughter Lily, the cancelled artist, the mention of the Vatra and the Zemlya ink. As she spoke, Anya's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and then to a deep, resonant sorrow. "Isolda Jovanovic," Anya whispered, the name a ghost on her lips. "I remember hearing of her. Her mother, Elena, was a true keeper, a powerful woman. They said when she married the American tech man, she took the sun with her from our valley. Her gnarled fingers found Ilara's, and now her daughter is to be wed. Baka, they want me to do it. The sunstone bridal pattern. I told them I knew it. Anya's grip tightened. Knowing is one thing, Ilara. Doing is another. It has been years since my hands could hold the cone steady. And you have the gift, the memory in your fingers, but you have never performed a full passage right. The strain, the focus. It takes more than skill. It takes a piece of your soul. I have to try, Ilara insisted. When I saw that other woman, the groom's mother, sneering at our traditions, calling them peasant rituals, I couldn't let her win. I couldn't let Isolde's memory be erased by a French manicure. A flicker of the old fire sparked in Anya's faded eyes. No, she said, a new strength in her voice. You could not. She pushed herself up from the chair with a grimace of pain. Come, we do not have much time. We must prepare the Zemlya properly. The earth must be woken with respect. In the small, cramped kitchen, Anya directed Ilara with the precision of a general commanding her army. From a dark wooden box carved with interlocking sigils, Ilara's only inheritance, they retrieved the precious ingredients. There was a small leather pouch of grey, powdery clay from a specific riverbank in their homeland, carried across an ocean and treasured for 2 decades. Anya had Ilara mix it with filtered water, not tap water. The city's pipes carry too much anger, she murmured. They added finely ground oak gall, a few drops of lavender oil that Anya had distilled herself, and a spoonful of sugar to make the paste smooth. Finally, Anya produced a tiny, silk-wrapped parcel. Inside was a small, rough piece of amber, the color of petrified honey. This was your great-grandmother's, Anya said, her voice thick with reverence. It has seen 3 generations of brides. We only use a scraping. It is not for the color, it is for the spirit within. With a small silver file, Ilara shaved a fine dust of amber into the dark, fragrant paste. As she stirred, she felt a strange warmth spread through the mixture, a hum of energy that was more than just chemistry. Anya began to chant softly in the old Vatra dialect, a song of blessing for the bride, for the marriage, for the continuation of life. While the paste rested, breathing under a damp cloth, Anya retrieved another treasure from the wooden box, a heavy, leather-bound book. The pages were brittle and yellowed with age, filled with hand-drawn patterns and spidery script in their native tongue. The Book of Sigils, Anya said, opening it to a page that depicted a breathtakingly complex design. The sunstone bridal pattern. Look closely, Ilara. It is not one pattern, but a story. She traced the lines with a trembling finger. Here, at the base of the palm, is the seed, the bride's past, her family line. From it grows the vine of life, wrapping around the wrist, representing her journey to this day. The flowers are the joys she has known. The thorns, hidden among the leaves, are the sorrows that have made her strong. Her finger moved to the center of the palm. And here, the sunstone, the circle of the sun, representing her new life, her own family. And inside it, the interlocking diamonds, a prayer for a bond that cannot be broken. She looked up, her eyes boring into Ilara's. You must not just copy the lines. You must feel the story. You must pour your own strength, your own hope for this girl, into every swirl. You are not just an artist tonight. You are a conduit. Ilara committed every curve and angle to memory, her mind racing. An hour later, she had carefully transferred the now perfect Zemlya ink into small, hand-rolled parchment cones. She packed them in the wooden box alongside the Book of Sigils, her hands moving with a purpose she had never felt before. Anya pressed a small, smooth river stone into her palm before she left. "Hold this if your focus wavers. It is from the same river as the clay. It remembers home." When Elara returned to the waiting limousine, the box held carefully in both hands, the driver looked at her with a newfound respect. She was no longer just the waitress from Queens. She was a woman carrying something ancient and sacred. As the car sped towards the gleaming towers of Manhattan, Elara clutched the riverstone in her pocket, feeling its cool, steady weight against her skin. She was terrified, but for the first time in a long time, she was not invisible. The Croft penthouse was less an apartment and more a kingdom in the sky. It occupied the top 3 floors of a slender, glass and steel tower in Tribeca, with panoramic views that made the city look like a carpet of scattered jewels. The decor was minimalist and masculine, all sharp lines, cool stone, and vast, empty spaces. It felt more like a modern art museum than a home, curated by a man who appreciated beauty but was terrified of warmth. The only hint of the woman who had once lived here was in the details. A collection of hand-thrown pottery on a floating shelf, a tapestry woven with rough, vibrant wool hanging on a stark white wall, and photographs. Everywhere there were photographs of Isolde. Isolde laughing on a sailboat, her hair wild in the wind. Isolde reading to a young Lily, a tender smile on her face. Isolde looking at her husband with an expression of such profound love that it made Elara's throat ache. Lily led Elara into a spacious sitting room, furnished with low couches and silk cushions, a deliberate echo of a more traditional space. A small, nervous woman who was introduced as the housekeeper, Maria, brought a tray of herbal tea and dates. Julian Croft stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to the room, a lonely silhouette against the city's infinite lights. He had been silent since they arrived, wrapped in a cocoon of his own memories. "We can start whenever you're ready," Lily said, her voice a small, hopeful sound in the vast room. She had changed into a simple silk robe, and her face was scrubbed clean of makeup, making her look younger, more vulnerable. Elara took a deep breath, setting her wooden box on a low table. She opened it, the earthy scent of the Zemlya ink filling the air, a small pocket of the old world in this temple of the new. She laid out her parchment cones, the Book of Sigils, and a small bowl of lemon sugar water for sealing the design. "Traditionally," Elara began, her voice soft but clear, the bride's closest female relatives and friends would be present. They would share stories, give advice. "There's only me," Lily said with a sad smile. "My mother's family is scattered, and my father." She glanced at his rigid back. "He finds this difficult." "I'm here," Julian said, turning from the window. His eyes were red-rimmed. He walked over and sat in a chair opposite the couch where Lily would sit, a silent, brooding sentinel. "I will witness it." Elara nodded. She motioned for Lily to extend her right hand, palm up. The rite would take hours, beginning with the hands, then the feet, a slow, methodical process of storytelling on skin. As she uncapped the first cone of ink, the tip hovering just above Lily's smooth, pale skin, a sharp, imperious buzz from the penthouse's private elevator echoed through the room. Julian's head snapped up. "I told them we were not to be disturbed." Maria scurried to the elevator, her face etched with worry. The doors slid open to reveal Beatrice Sterling, her face a mask of cold fury. She was flanked by a younger man in a perfectly tailored suit, her son and Lily's fiancé, Thomas. "I knew it," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with venom as she swept into the room, her eyes landing on Elara and the open box of supplies. I knew you would go through with this insanity. Thomas, look at what they're doing. They are marking your future wife with mud." Thomas looked deeply uncomfortable, his gaze shifting from his mother to his fiancée to his future father-in-law. "Mother, perhaps we should have called. I am the groom's mother. I have a right to be here, to prevent my family from being subjected to this primitive spectacle." She advanced on Elara, her diamond rings flashing like weapons. "You, get your filthy concoctions out of this home, now!" Elara froze, the cone of ink trembling in her hand. All the courage she had summoned seemed to evaporate under the heat of Beatrice's rage. "That's enough, Beatrice," Julian said, his voice low and dangerous. He hadn't moved from his chair, but his presence seemed to fill the room. "Enough? It is not nearly enough." Beatrice turned her fury on him. "You are letting your grief over Isolde cloud your judgment." She was a lovely woman, Julian, but she was always filling Lily's head with these folk tales. It was charming when she was a child, but this is her wedding. She is marrying into the Sterling family, a family with a legacy in this city that dates back to the Gilded Age. We do not show up to St. Patrick's with tribal tattoos on our hands. "It's not a tattoo," Lily cried, pulling her hand away. "It's my mother's heritage, and mine." "It is embarrassing," Beatrice spat, "and I will not have it." She looked at her son. "Thomas, tell her." Thomas cleared his throat, unable to meet Lily's eyes. "Lily, darling, Mother has a point. It's a bit much. For our friends, our family, maybe we could tone it down. A small flower on the wrist, perhaps?" The betrayal in Lily's eyes was a palpable thing. To have her fiancé side with his mother, to dismiss her deepest wish as a bit much, was a blow more painful than any of Beatrice's insults. Tears streamed down Lily's face as she stood up. "Get out," she whispered. "Both of you, just get out." "We will not." Beatrice's voice rose to a shriek. She took a step toward the table, her hand outstretched, as if to sweep Elara's precious box to the floor. "I will put a stop to this farce myself." It was the threat to the box, to the Zemlia ink mixed with her great-grandmother's amber, to the book of sigils that held her people's history, that finally broke Elara's paralysis. Anya's voice echoed in her mind. "You are a conduit. You are a keeper." She moved, placing herself between Beatrice and the table, shielding the box with her own body. She was shorter than Beatrice, slighter, dressed in simple clothes, but in that moment she seemed to draw power from the very floor beneath her. "You will not touch this," Elara said, her voice quiet but ringing with an authority that stunned the room into silence. She looked directly into Beatrice's furious eyes, unafraid. "You call this mud. My people call it the earth, the very ground that remembers our ancestors when the world has tried to make us forget. You call these folk tales. We call them the laws of our spirit." She turned to Thomas, her gaze filled not with anger, but with a profound pity. "You ask her to tone down her heritage. Would you ask her to tone down the color of her eyes, the beat of her heart? Her mother gave her this legacy. It is the last, best gift she has to offer. And you are asking her to trade it for the approval of people who measure worth in stock prices and country club memberships." She then faced Beatrice again, her voice softening, but losing none of its power. "This ink will fade in a few weeks, but the memory of you trying to scrub away the last piece of her mother that she has to hold on to, that will stain her heart forever. Is that the foundation upon which you want this marriage to be built?" The silence that followed was absolute. Thomas looked ashen, finally understanding the gravity of his words. Lily was staring at Alara with wide, tear-filled eyes, an expression of pure, unadulterated gratitude on her face. It was Julian Croft who broke the spell. He rose slowly from his chair, walking not to his daughter or his guests, but to stand beside Alara, a silent, unshakable ally. He looked at Beatrice, and the grief in his eyes had been replaced by a cold, hard fire. "My wife, Isolde," he began, his voice resonating with a deep, controlled power, "endured the condescension of people like you for our entire marriage. She was the strongest, wisest, most authentic human being I have ever known. And I, in my arrogance, often treated her traditions as a charming hobby rather than the bedrock of her soul. I saw them as something belonging to her past, not as a vital part of our future." He looked at Lily, his voice breaking slightly. "I failed her in that. I will not fail her memory. And I will not fail our daughter." He turned his gaze back to Beatrice and Thomas, and it was the gaze of a king passing sentence. "This ceremony will proceed. The Vatra sigils will be drawn. My daughter will walk down the aisle of St. Patrick's Cathedral, carrying the full strength and history of her mother's people on her skin. And she will do so as a Croft. If the sterling name finds that embarrassing, then perhaps this alliance was a mistake." The threat, unspoken but crystal clear, hung in the air. The merger of their two great families was not just about love, it was about power, influence, and billions of dollars in shared interests. Beatrice's face went pale. She had overplayed her hand, assuming Julian's grief had made him weak. She had forgotten that grief can also forge steel. She looked at her son, expecting him to argue, to salvage the situation, but Thomas was looking at Lily with an expression of dawning horror and regret. "Get out, Beatrice," Julian said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm, "and take your son with you. Lily will call him tomorrow to discuss whether she still wishes to marry a man who asks her to be less than who she is." Without another word, Beatrice turned on her heel and marched to the elevator, a queen in furious retreat. Thomas hesitated, opening his mouth to speak to Lily, but she simply turned her back on him. Defeated, he followed his mother. The elevator doors slid shut, sealing them in their silent, gilded cage. The room exhaled. The violent tension dissipated, leaving behind a fragile, sacred peace. Lily collapsed onto the couch, sobbing with relief and heartbreak. Julian went to her, gathering her in his arms, holding her with a tenderness Alara hadn't thought him capable of. After a few moments, Lily looked up at Alara, her face wet with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. You were her voice. You has." The silence that descended after the elevator doors closed was absolute, a vacuum where the storm of Beatrice's fury had been. It was a fragile, crystalline quiet, broken only by a choked sob from Lily, who sank onto the silk couch as if her bones had dissolved. Julian moved to her side, his large frame, usually so rigid and imposing, folding around his daughter in an embrace of profound, clumsy tenderness. He stroked her hair, murmuring words too low for Alara to hear, his face buried in her shoulder. A father sheltering his child from a world he had, until now, failed to navigate for her. Alara stood by her table of sacred things, her heart a wild drum, slowing to a steady, resonant beat. She felt strangely calm, emptied of fear. The woman who had placed her body between a billionaire's fury and a bowl of sacred clay was not the same one who had trembled while pouring water an hour earlier. She had spoken with a voice that was not entirely her own, a voice threaded with the authority of her grandmother and her grandmother's mother before her. She was a conduit, a keeper. The words were no longer just a memory. They were a mantle she had just unknowingly claimed. After several minutes, Lily's sobs subsided into shuddering breaths. She looked up from her father's arms, her eyes red and swollen but clear, and her gaze found Ilara. A watery, grateful smile touched her lips. "Thank you," she whispered, the words imbued with a meaning that went far beyond mere politeness. You were her voice. You spoke for her." Ilara offered a small, solemn nod, her own throat tight with emotion. She picked up the parchment cone, its weight familiar and right in her palm. Her hand, which had trembled under Beatrice's glare, was now as steady as a surgeon's. She knelt on a silk cushion before Lily, a gesture of service and reverence. She took Lily's outstretched hand, turning it palm up to the soft light of the room. It was a beautiful hand, pale and unblemished, a blank page waiting for its story to be written. With Julian watching over them, a silent, grieving sentinel, Ilara touched the fine tip of the cone to the center of Lily's palm. She drew the first line. It was not a line, but a single, perfect seed. The Sem Života, the beginning of everything. The ink flowed, a deep, earthy black against the pale skin, a silent, indelible promise that memory would not be erased, that heritage would not be broken, that a mother's love, even from beyond the veil, would always find a way to arm her child. For the next 6 hours, time in the Croft penthouse ceased to be linear. It became a spiral, drawing inward to the small, sacred space on the couch. The city outside, with its sirens and its ceaseless hum, vanished. The world narrowed to the whisper of the parchment cone on skin, the earthy, lavender-tinged scent of the Zemlya, and the low murmur of voices telling stories. Ilara entered a state of profound concentration, a waking dream where the patterns in the Book of Sigils came alive in her mind's eye. She was not merely copying lines, she was weaving a narrative, a prayer in pigment, with the vine of life, the Loza Sudbine, that wrapped around Lily's wrist. She poured in the resilience of her own journey, the strength it took to cross an ocean and build a new life from nothing. As she drew the delicate blossoms of joy, the Kvetovi Radosti, she thought of her grandmother's rare, full-throated laugh. And when she inked the hidden thorns of sorrow, the Tunya Tuga, among the leaves, she allowed a sliver of her own inherited grief, for a lost country, for a scattered people, to flow into the design, knowing that strength is forged in sorrow, not in its absence. Julian remained in his chair, a statue carved from grief. He did not move, did not speak for hours. He simply watched. His gaze was an intense, physical presence in the room, but it was no longer skeptical. It was the gaze of a man witnessing an act of resurrection. The Zemlya ink, dark and potent, was not just staining his daughter's skin. It was seeping into the sterile atmosphere of his home, filling the empty spaces Isolde had left behind. He saw his wife in the curve of a line that mimicked her handwriting, heard her voice in the Vatra names Ilara whispered for each sigil. He remembered Isolde trying to explain it to him once, years ago, on a terrace overlooking the Adriatic. "It is not decoration, Julian," she had said, her hands smelling of the same earthy paste. "It is a map of the soul. It shows a woman where she has been and gives her the strength for where she is going." He had smiled, kissed her forehead, and called it beautiful, but he hadn't understood. He had filed it away with her other, charming rusticisms. The crushing weight of his failure to see her, to truly see the universe she carried within her, settled upon him, a grief sharper and more profound than the one he had felt at her funeral. As Ilara's hands moved with hypnotic grace, Lily began to speak, her voice soft in the quiet room. She told stories of her mother, not the grand, tragic tales, but the small, intimate ones. She used to say the rain had a different song in the city than it did in the mountains, Lily murmured, her eyes fixed on the growing pattern on her arm. Here, it was an angry drum on the glass. Back home, it was a whisper that told the seeds to grow. She tried to teach me. We'd sit on the balcony during a storm, and she'd have me close my eyes and listen for the whispers. Julian made a sound, a rough, strangled noise in his throat. "I remember that," he said, his voice raw. "I bought her a sound system, the best in the world. I told her she could listen to a recording of a mountain rainstorm whenever she wanted. Crystal clear audio." He shook his head, a gesture of self-loathing. She smiled and thanked me, and she never sat on the balcony during a storm again. I thought she was happy. I thought my technology had solved a problem. But I paved over her memory with convenience. The confession hung in the air, heavy and painful. Ilara continued her work, her lines becoming a conduit for the room's shared sorrow and burgeoning understanding. She was not just decorating a bride, she was presiding over a long-overdue wake, helping a husband and daughter grieve not just the woman they had lost, but the parts of her they had never truly known. When she finally reached the center of the palm and began the sunstone, the Sunchev Kamen, she felt a shift. This was the sigil of the future, of the new family to be forged. As she drew the interlocking diamonds within the circle of the sun, a prayer for an unbreakable bond, she didn't think of Thomas's weakness. Instead, she poured into the ink a fierce, protective hope that Lily would have the strength to demand a love that was worthy of her, a love that did not ask her to be smaller. As the first pale fingers of dawn stroked the sky, painting the city in hues of lavender and rose gold, Ilara drew the final line on Lily's left foot. It was done. The air in the room seemed to hum with a quiet, ancient power. She leaned back, a wave of exhaustion so profound it was almost dizzying washing over her. It was as Anya had warned. The rite took a piece of your soul, but in its place it left a sense of deep, resonant purpose. Lily held up her hands, turning them in the nascent light. The intricate patterns, still wet and black, seemed to pulse with a life of their own. "It's her," she whispered, tears tracking silently down her cheeks. "It's like I'm holding her hands." Julian rose and came to kneel beside his daughter. He didn't speak. He reached out a trembling finger, not to touch the ink, but to trace the air just above the sunstone sigil, his expression one of utter, heart-breaking reverence. Ilara began the final step, carefully painting the dried paste with a lemon sugar solution to seal the art and darken the stain. "You must rest now," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. "Leave the paste on for as long as you can, at least 8 hours. When you scrape it off, the stain will be orange. Do not be alarmed. It will deepen over the next 48 hours. It will find its true voice on your skin." She began to pack her things into the wooden box, her movements slow, her body aching. The adrenaline had vanished, leaving a hollow, humming fatigue in its place. "Wait," Julian said. He went to a stark, minimalist desk in the corner, took out a checkbook, and wrote with swift, decisive strokes. He returned and held it out to her. Ilara glanced down. The number was astronomical, a figure that could erase every financial worry she and her grandmother had ever had. It was a king's ransom. She looked from the check to his face, and for the first time, she saw past the titan of industry to the broken man beneath. He was trying to pay for his absolution. Gently, with a hand that still bore faint traces of the Zemlya ink, she pushed the check back toward him. "Sir, I cannot accept this." "It's not a request," he said, his voice regaining a sliver of its usual command. "You performed an invaluable service. This is compensation." "No," Elara said softly, but with an unshakable firmness. "You misunderstand. What happened in this room tonight was not a service. It was a sacrament. To put a price on it is to make it a commodity. My grandmother would say it is like trying to buy a prayer." She met his pale blue eyes directly. "My honor was in the doing of it. The gift was in the giving." She picked up a pen from his desk, drew a single, clean line through the staggering figure, and wrote a new one in the margin. $500. "This is for the clay from the Dinaric Alps, for the amber that belonged to my great-grandmother, for the parchment and the oils, and for my time away from my other work. It is a fair and honest price." Julian stared at the amended check, then at her. He had spent his entire adult life in a world where everything and everyone could be quantified, assigned a value, bought, sold, or acquired. Her refusal was not a negotiating tactic. It was a statement of principle from a world with a different ledger, a different currency. It was the world Isolde had come from, and in that moment he felt the chasm between his reality and his late wife's as a physical void. He slowly, deliberately, tore the check into 4 perfect squares and let them fall onto the desk. "As you wish," he said, his voice quiet. "But you are wrong about one thing. This is not the end of our transaction. It is the beginning. I have a debt to you, Miss Vance, to your grandmother, and to my wife. And it is a debt I intend to honor." The next afternoon, Lily called. Her voice was not the trembling whisper of the night before. It was clear and resonant, like a bell. "He came this morning," she said, without preamble. "Thomas. He came alone. My father let him in, and then left us. He didn't try to make excuses, Elara. He just fell apart. He said he's spent his entire life trying to earn his mother's approval. This tiny, conditional thing she holds out and pulls back, and he didn't realize he was trading his own soul for it." "What did you say?" Elara asked, twisting the phone cord around her fingers. "I told him I loved him, but that I couldn't marry a man whose spine was on loan from his mother. I showed him my hands. The paste was off, and the stain, oh Elara, it's the color of a new fire. I told him, this is me. This is my mother. This is my history. It is not up for negotiation. It is not something to be toned down for your friends. Can you love all of this? Can you defend it, even from your own mother?" He just cried and said he would spend the rest of his life trying. "Are you still getting married?" There was a pause. "Yes," Lily said, and her voice was full of a new, tempered strength. "But it will be a different marriage than the one we were heading for. It will be an honest one. And it will start with me walking down that aisle tomorrow, wearing my mother's armor." She took a breath. "Which is why I'm calling. My father insists. You and your grandmother are to be at the wedding, not as guests, as family. In the front pew. St. Patrick's Cathedral was a cavern of soaring stone and stained glass, filled with the hushed, expectant rustle of New York's high society. Elara sat beside Anya in the front pew, a place of impossible honor. Anya, wearing a traditional embroidered shawl she hadn't touched in 20 years, looked not frail, but regal, a displaced queen returned to her court. Across the aisle, Beatrice Sterling sat ramrod straight, her face a perfect, placid mask of polite indifference. But her defeat was palpable. It was in the way her son, Thomas, standing at the altar, did not once look to her for approval. his eyes fixed solely on the cathedral doors. When the organ swelled and Lily appeared at the entrance on her father's arm, a collective gasp rippled through the congregation. Her gown was a masterpiece of simple, timeless elegance, but it was her hands that commanded attention. With sleeves pushed back to her elbows, the sigils were on full display. Against the creamy white of the silk, the deep, reddish-brown patterns were not primitive. They were breathtaking. They spoke of a history deeper than any Gilded Age legacy, a beauty more profound than any diamond. They were a declaration. As they passed the front pew, Julian Croft caught Ilara's eye. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, an acknowledgement of a debt being honoured. At the reception, a lavish affair in the Temple of Dender at the Met, something remarkable happened. Julian, instead of hiding Anya and Ilara away, made them the centre of his orbit. He introduced Anya not as a friend's grandmother, but as Anya Petrova, a matriarch of the Vatra and a keeper of the sigils. He asked her, with Ilara translating, to explain the meaning of the patterns on Lily's hands, a circle of people whose collective net worth could alter global markets leaned in, listening with rapt attention as Anya spoke of the sun and the seed, of thorns and of blossoms. Beatrice watched from a distance, exiled to the social periphery, a ghost at the feast. For the first time, the authentic had proven more valuable than the contrived, and she had no currency here. A week later, the invitation was not to an office, but to the penthouse. When Ilara and Anya arrived, the cavernous space felt different, warmer. A vibrant, hand-woven Vatra tapestry now hung on the main wall, and the minimalist table held a vase of wildflowers instead of a sterile sculpture. Julian did not offer them champagne. He had Maria, the housekeeper, serve them a specific blend of linden tea, which he had learned was Anya's favorite. He sat with them, not behind a desk, but in an armchair, creating a circle. "I have been reading my wife's journals," he began, his voice quiet. "Things I should have read years ago. In one, she wrote about her fear that the Vatra stories would die with her mother's generation. She wrote, 'It is like a library is burning down, and the world is warming its hands by the fire, not realizing what is being lost.'" He looked at Anya, his eyes filled with a clear, unshielded pain. "I was one of those people, warming my hands. I failed her. I cannot undo that. But I can stop the fire from consuming the rest of the library." He slid a leather-bound portfolio onto the coffee table. "I am establishing a foundation, the Isolde Jovanovic Croft Foundation for the Preservation of Vanishing Cultures. Its first and primary mission will be the complete documentation, preservation, and revitalization of the Vatra people." He detailed his plan. An academic and cultural center in New York, funding for field research in the Balkans to record the oral histories of the last remaining elders, a digital archive of the language, and a program to teach the traditional arts. "I would be honored," he said, his gaze resting on Anya, "if you would serve as its senior cultural advisor. A lifetime appointment, with a stipend and medical care that will ensure you want for nothing." Then he turned to Ilara. "And I want you to be its founding artistic director. Not as a favor, as a professional. You will have a budget, a staff, and the complete autonomy to build a program that brings the Vatra arts into the future. You will teach, you will create, you will curate, you will be the bridge." He named a salary that made Ilara's breath catch. It wasn't a gift. It was a validation. It was a career. Anya was silent for a long moment, her gnarled fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. Then she looked at Julian and asked a question in her own tongue, her voice surprisingly strong. Ilara translated. "Why now, Mr. Croft? Why not when she was alive to see it? Julian did not flinch. He met the old woman's gaze and gave the only answer that mattered. "Because I was a fool," he said, the words stripped bare of ego. "Because I was blind, and now I see. I am doing it now, because it is all I have left to give her." Anya nodded slowly, a deep, ancient wisdom in her eyes. It was an acceptance not just of the offer, but of his atonement. 6 months later, Ilara stood in the center of a sun-drenched studio in a West Village brownstone. The air smelled of clay, drying herbs and turpentine. The walls were covered not with finished pieces, but with works in progress, sketches of sigils, test patches of ink on parchment, looms with half-finished weavings. Her life was no longer about maintaining a sterile perfection. It was about the beautiful, creative chaos of building something new. Her grandmother sat by the window, not in a lonely apartment, but in a comfortable chair, dictating the epic of their people to a young, wide-eyed ethnographer from Columbia University, her voice finally being recorded for posterity. Ilara's phone buzzed. It was a message from Lily, a photo from a wind-swept coast in Ireland. She and Thomas stood on a cliff, their arms around each other. Lily's hand was held up to the camera, palm forward. The Zemlya ink had long since faded, vanished back into the ether, but the strength it had imparted remained. The caption read, "The armor is invisible now, but I can still feel it. Thank you for giving me back my mother, and for giving me back myself." Ilara smiled. She looked down at her own hands. They were not the pristine, invisible hands of a waitress. They were stained. There was a smear of charcoal on her thumb, a fleck of dried clay under a nail, and a faint, almost imperceptible reddish-brown tint to her fingertips from the countless batches of Zemlya ink she had mixed. The ink had not just stained Lily's skin for a few weeks. It had stained Ilara's life, permanently. It was the color of earth, of history, of purpose. She was no longer a refugee, a waitress, a ghost. She was a keeper, and her work had just begun.